Hey everybody, Mike here. Hope you're doing well. Summer's wrapping up. In Ohio anyway, school starts in mid-August, which I think is unholy, definitely unbiblical and unhelpful. We just returned from a couple of weeks on vacation, and so grateful to be back home, but so great to see so many people in what for us was home for 20 years. So thank you for all of those of you who contribute on Patreon. And I feel like I always have to say this because this is our livelihood, at least a significant part of it. And for those of you who support us that way, it's very meaningful. Absolutely. There'll be another Revelation podcast later this week out. I'm behind because of vacation, but I've got one cooking that I hope will be helpful. Thank you too for those of you who like, subscribe, and review us on iTunes. That keeps us kind of how whatever algorithm is used, it keeps us sort of at the forefront of attention by iTunes, and so it means a lot. It's encouraging, but it also helps people find the podcast, and so we're very, very grateful for all of those things. There've been a couple of really high profile things that have happened the last week or two involving a couple of men that I have admired for quite some time. One of them is named Bill Hybels. He was the founder of Willow Creek Community Church and the founder of something called the Willow Creek Association. And Willow Creek has been one of the most influential churches, and Bill Hybels has been one of the most influential leaders in the evangelical movement for years now. And the last several months, it's been coming out that there have been very courageous women who've been coming forward with stories of inappropriate touching and inappropriate acting and behaving. And initially, Bill's response was, no, this never happened. And people were colluding against him and all sorts of things. And then recently, as more and more of these women have come forward, I think it's up to 10 now. There's just the realization that no, you can deny it all you want, but there's something obviously happened, and I don't know that we'll know Bill's side of it adequately, but certainly the women have brought forward very credible stories, and with nothing to gain, that put Bill's denials in in sharp perspective. He's no longer at the church, but the fallout of this, and in fact, I'm recording this on a Monday. Just yesterday, a new set of allegations was released in the New York Times from a longtime assistant. And I have a friend on staff there who's in leadership, and he's just been consumed by how to best navigate some of the decisions that are now sitting before him, because he had no idea all this stuff was out there, or the accusations that were coming. So it's just been a mess. And then the other guy has been another, and Bill, by the way, was very much a leadership guru. I mean, his sweet spot was talking about church leadership. Like, that was his thing. And he'd written like 50 books, a lot of those on leadership. I mean, and he sponsors this Leadership Global Summit that would bring in leaders from all across the world. I mean, it's a huge deal. So this is a big thing that's happening. And closer to home, a guy I admire named Meyer, who is the head football coach at Ohio State University, a job that I've often coveted. Urban, it turns out, lied. So he had hired, when he was a coach in Florida, a guy named Zach Smith is his wide receivers coach. Zach Smith has had a history of domestic violence allegations, no indictments, no arrests, but certainly allegations. And recent allegations came to light. Zach was fired. Urban was asked about how much Urban knew about the allegations, particularly in 2015. He denied he knew anything about them, and then it came out, of course, that he did. So he's on administrative leave, and there's all sorts of investigative reporting and going on here. But Urban was another leadership guru. I mean, he was. I actually read his leadership book on how to create a football culture. I just love this stuff. I'm so weird. And both of these guys I really looked up to. And as this has unfolded over the last, for Hybels, it's been a couple of months at least, probably 3 or 4. For Urban, it's been, the last couple of weeks. It struck because I've always been attracted. It struck me. I've always been attracted to that kind of model of leadership. It's the point person. It's the CEO. It's the lone visionary pastor up on a mountain wrestling with God and coming down the mountain to enlighten the masses as to what we should be doing. It's that model of leadership that I've been so immersed in. It's like the head coach leadership. It's the CEO model of leadership. And when you get to the New Testament, of course, you have personalities like Peter obviously was a significant leader, and Paul was a significant leader. But you also have this sense of plurality, that leadership was held by not just significant personalities, but by teams and groups of people. And for me, when I read about these sort of leadership failures, the first thing that happens, of course, is it just strikes terror into my heart because I know what I'm capable of. Money, sex, and power are the temptations of leadership, and in a lot of the ways, and we've talked about this before in the podcast, but in a lot of ways, the American church, at least some versions of it, are set up precisely to feed those temptations in the life of a big name senior pastor, right? There's a massive platform. There's tons of exposure. But even for those that don't have a big platform, what's sold to us is that success looks like the big, the better, the bold production, the polished service. I'm trying to think of other P's. The progressive, I don't know. I mean, it's that the event that you do is awesome and it's amazing. You have this compelling staff team and you're pulling off just this audacious, big, hairy, audacious goals, they were called when I was a bit younger. And that was the model of leadership that spilled over. So even if you weren't one of these megachurch pastors, you still were tempted by that picture of success and that picture of leadership. I just want you to know I got an email, and it's from American Express, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to know that we had an expense that just hit our credit card for an athletic club that we belong to in Columbus, Ohio. So there you go. An athletic club clearly not used by yours truly enough, but an athletic club nevertheless. Now, so here's Urban, here's Bill, and regardless of your take on the situations, clearly there's a breakdown personally, which, I'm capable of. I'm the biggest sinner in the room, no question about it. But there also seems to be breakdown in culture. And this is what is so interesting in church leadership is all I've known has been the pastor as CEO model. My friend Todd Proctor and I led a church called Rock Harbor where we tried to break out of that, where we both led together in separate spheres. He was the lead guy over everything else, and I was the lead teacher, and we kind of led in this partnership. And it was super tough because both of us had been raised on a certain view of leadership, and thankfully, I think more and more, particularly among the younger crowd, are realizing the perils of that CEO model of leadership. But so the first thing that happens when I see this stuff is I always look inward and go, oh my goodness, I could be so capable of exaggerating or lying to protect myself, or getting in situations that I would never want reported, or whatever it is, right? I mean, that's just part of walking as a frail human person, is the recognition of weak spots. And so that is always the first thing that happens. But the thing that's been really chewing at me has been, have we succumbed to this view of leadership and the concordant view of success? So if that's the view of leadership we've embraced, the view of success that we've embraced goes right along with it. It's personality driven, numbers driven, And it just calls, I think, into question where the American church is headed and why it doesn't experience much of God's power. We've talked before about the fact that, God's quite clear in the scriptures. If you make much of your own power, you're not going to see much of his. His power is only made perfect when ours is brought to an end. And so the American church, and me too, have fallen in love with big, vast displays of power and numbers and moments and experiences, and yet you go to a church in the developing world, and the presence of God seems thicker there, and there really isn't much of a reason why. So nothing really more to add except that we've talked a bunch on the podcast about church and leadership and all of those sorts of things, and just a confession that I don't. This was the model I've been raised in, and it's the model I like. I mean, of course, if you had a choice between doing the hard work of plural leadership or doing the hard work or doing the easy work of just being an autocratic leader, I would choose autocratic leader. Just confessing my sin here. But it does. It's this beautiful, like, calling into question this leadership culture that we've created. Got a couple questions, and trying to stay ahead of it. We're going to start, like I've said a couple times, we're going to start a Q&A, separate podcast, like 5 minutes, just do one question at a time. Crank those out, be awesome. But these have accumulated in the inbox, and so I was excited to get to some of these. My friend Joe, this was a kid in my college group. I'm not sure if you remember me from college group days. Oh, I do. But I was there when you came screaming in as William Wallace, dressed up in a kilt and with blue face paint. I did do that, absolutely. Anyhow, my cohort chaplain friend and I have been trying to put to bed the idea of Calvinism in one of our other chaplains. The Calvinistic believer says all Christians are at least 3 points of the TULIP acrostic, which he means. So the TULIP acrostic is a very popular and oversimplified summary of some branches of Reformed theology. TULIP, the T stands for total depravity, the U stands for unconditional election, the L stands for limited atonement, the I stands for irresistible grace, and the P stands for perseverance of the saints. And let me go through those, because Joe's friend argues it doesn't matter if you're a Calvinist or not. Every Christian is 3 of these: the T, the U, and the L. And I'm going to disagree. Now, if I geek out a little bit on this, I'm so sorry. We've talked in other podcasts about some issues we have with some Reformed theology, and so it won't be shocking to you that perhaps I would disagree. So let me go over the acrostic, and again, if I'm not doing it justice as if we were to spend an hour on each of the points. They would be much more nuanced than this. T is the idea of total depravity, which means that there isn't one iota of the universe that has not been touched or affected by the fall, and that our depravity is total. So Paul is quoted in Romans and Paul himself in Romans is quoting a bunch of Psalms talking about there's no one good, there's not even one. And the idea is that we are fallen and we cannot get up. we are absolutely irredeemable on our own. There's nothing we can do about our situation. The U is something called unconditional election. It's that God unconditionally, and that means independently of human choice, action, or merit, God elects or chooses people to rescue. Now, so this gets into the idea of predestination, the idea that God sovereignly chooses those people who will spend eternity with him, and concomitantly is either choosing actively or just simply allowing those who aren't chosen to then spend eternity apart from him. And there are all kinds of ways this sort of thing is trying to be nuanced and put together. But unconditional election means that God chooses. And he chooses salvifically. Now, the L is a logical follow-up from the U. If God chooses people, and not everyone, if God chooses only some to be with him forever, then the work of Jesus was only for those that are elect. It's called limited atonement. And it's the idea that the work of Jesus is only efficacious for those whom God has previously chosen. So it's not unlimited atonement, it's just limited. The I is irresistible grace, that when God calls you, you're coming. Like God, God's call is irresistible. Like you can try to resist it, you can try to fight it, you can try to doubt it, but God's calling of you cannot be fought. You may think you're fighting it, but that's just all part of the process of wooing you into his kingdom. Which makes sense if he's unconditionally choosing you, that you're going to say yes to that, right? That's the irresistible grace part. You're just going to say yes. And then the P naturally follows from the L and the I, and it's called perseverance of the saints. If you are rescued, if you are indeed one of God's elect, you can never lose that election, right? Because you did nothing to gain salvation, so you can do nothing to lose it. So that is, in a very choppy way, in a very unnuanced way that my Reformed brothers and sisters would have all sorts of problems with, that is a brief definition of the TULIP acrostic. Now, Joe's question is, hey, my friend says everybody, regardless of whether you are Calvinist or not, is at least agrees on the T, the U, and the L. And Joe, I disagree with this. Total depravity. Let's talk about that one. It depends what you mean by total. If total means we are fallen as far as we could possibly fall, and there is nothing good about us, then I would completely disagree. It is clear from the Old Testament that the image of God still resides in human persons, and that we are capable of goodness. Common grace, which is a Reformed doctrine, suggests that we are not as bad as we could be, though certainly we are not as good as we should be. And so if he means that we are totally, completely, and utterly fallen, there's nothing good in us, I could not disagree more. I would agree that that salvation is by grace alone. It's not something we earn or merit. There's no like, well, I'm a good person, so I get to go, right? Nope, that's not the way it works. That we are fallen, absolutely. But depending on how he would define total, the word total, I don't know if I'd agree or not. Unconditional election, I absolutely disagree with. Absolutely. And I'll say this as strongly as I can, knowing that so many people will disagree. Well, this will have to be a separate podcast. But election in the Bible is corporate. It is. It deals with nations. My Calvinist brothers and sisters drastically misuse a passage in Romans 9 through 11 to justify the idea that God selects some people to go to heaven and some people to go to hell. Paul is not talking about people going to heaven or hell, first of all. He's talking about nations and how the Jews and the Gentiles relate to each other. He uses people like Jacob and Esau as examples. However, Jacob and Esau very clearly in the Genesis account stand for nations. And so I think that whole passage and certain passages in John have been dramatically misread to think that the salvation of individual persons is what is being taught here. Absolutely, I disagree. So I'll save some ammo on that, just because I think it's worthy of its own podcast. But what God elects are nations. So he elected Israel, and the election is never for its own salvation. The election is always for mission. So I got stuff on this. And on the scale of passion, I kind of rise up a little bit, because I think the idea that God, for whatever it is and however it works, that God sits wherever God is sitting and chooses people to go to. It's like being a lifeguard and having the power to, let's say you see 30 people drowning. You have the power to save all of them. Your Bible says you want to save all of them, but you choose to only save 10 of them. I don't get how that logic works, and I don't think it's biblical. I'm so sorry, and I know people will disagree with that. The L I don't agree with, because I don't agree with the U. The L only works if you agree with the U. So if God died, or if God wants all to come to him and have a knowledge of the truth, then Jesus's work can be applied to everyone, regardless of whether or not you're elect in the way that the Calvinists think that election is applied, works or not, right? So for me, the atonement of Jesus is ready to be applied to anybody who calls upon his name. Anybody, anywhere, with any background, any history. Absolutely. All you have to do is cry out to God for salvation, and the work of Jesus has already been applied. Absolutely. It was happened while we were still sinners. So Joe, great to hear from you. Remember, I mean, when you get into theological conversations, the goal isn't to win. I always want to win. But Dallas Willard has this great line. He's like, I'm sure that Jesus would be the first person to tell us that we should follow the truth wherever it leads us. And I love that. So the issue, I would say is, okay, well, this person's probably been immersed in some Reformed scholars. Have they ever read the opposite side? Are they even open to reading the opposite side? Because you can be a good and faithful Jesus follower and not agree with this, and you can be a good and faithful Jesus follower and think this is the way that it works. So the goal isn't to change people's minds. The goal is to discover the truth together. So for me, I would just urge you to be gentle, and I'm sure you are. But I think there's enough to quibble there that it would be interesting to have another podcast conversation about it. Question number 2. Mike, been listening to you for about a year and a half. You've helped me change my thinking to the better on the whole view of what it means to be a Christian. Well, thank you for that. I hope you get out more than just me. I was thinking you might want to find a college student or theology intern or a 30-something-year-old to do this podcast with. Otherwise, it's church. When one person is talking, it's church. Not that your thought-provoking words are bad, because they're great. Another voice brings a different dimension to your show. Also, you were talking about sound issues. Clearly, dude, if you put up a sign in the area of audio visuals at your local college asking for interns, you could save yourself some money and help a student learn more about the word. Just saying. And this is from my friend Krista. Now, first of all, Krista, thank you for the feedback. I couldn't agree with you more. So that's why I've been doing podcasts with random friends, because the gift that Andy has been was certainly the producing and editing skills that he brought to the table. But it quickly became evident that having another person in the room that wasn't like me was a really, really good thing. And so the future of the Vox podcast is this. We want to really up our game. So we're going to hire a producer that will edit and record and do all of those sorts of things. We want to find a couple of different co-hosts, and at least one of those. And the issue with Andy, of course, is he and I could do it on Skype, but it's not the same energy. It's not the same sort of dynamic. So I couldn't agree with you more, Krista, that we need an Andy in Ohio. And I'm hoping that one of the co-hosts would be a young lady, person of color, somebody who is, struggling with issues of sexuality. I mean, whatever, a non sort of mainstream podcast voice would be very fun for me. So I couldn't agree with you more. I'm on it. I'm working on it. We want to very much continue to invest in the podcast, and glad it's been helpful thus far. Third question, and then we'll wrap up. Hello, Mike. Been listening to your podcast since day one. Holy cow. Thank you for listening. I remember you taking a question about how Matthew 18:20 is often misused. I've been combing your podcast and can't find it. Do you mind directing me to the podcast where you talked about this? I looked, and this is from Jimmy. Jimmy, I looked today and I could not find what podcast it was. I'm guessing it was one of the very early ones where we were talking about church discipline or judgment, the way like table fellowship could be a different way to understand the way a community fellowships. And I'm guessing it was one of the early episodes. But Matthew 18:20, for those of you that don't know, is a verse that is much quoted in Christian circles. The verse itself is, For where two or three gather in my name, there I am with them. And the idea is if you and another Jesus follower are at a coffee shop together, there Jesus is with you. You can call that a church, or you can call that a gathering, or whatever. It's usually spoken of in the context of fellowship, which is a Christian cliche word that just means like relationship. And so you'll hear this, how many, like a question was on my Facebook feed today, how many people constitute a church? And of course, this is the verse people go to. Well, where two or three are gathered, there I am, Jesus said. The issue, per usual, is we yank these things out of context without any regard for what comes before and after. So Jesus is dealing with an issue called church discipline, and the issue is pretty simple. I mean, it's just how believers in Jesus and followers of Jesus should handle conflict. And Jesus gives very practical instruction. He says in verse 15, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you, right? So no gossip, no posting on social media, no triangulating with other people, just go to them. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. Now, this was from Deuteronomy. And the sin that Jesus is talking about isn't an offense. It's like, ooh, that hurt my feelings. This is, there's been some injury done, and not just physical injury, but something more significant than just, well, I didn't like the way the person was talking to me. So go by yourself. If not, take two or three witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And remember, the church here that he's referring to is probably 20 people, 25 people that meets in a house. So this is not standing up in a mega church saying, well, Aunt Sally in row 47A, sinned in this way this week, and we all need to ostracize her. That's not at all what he's talking about. He says, go by yourself, then two or three witnesses. If that doesn't work, take it to the church, which was a small group of 20 to 30 people. And then he says, if they refuse to even listen to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector. Now, Jesus, of course, treats pagans and tax collectors very well and with love, but they weren't considered part of the church community until they'd repented. So the idea is you treat this person graciously, you have table fellowship, you love them, pursue them, but you don't consider them part of the family until they repent. Now then, and these are very confusing words, Jesus says, truly I tell you, he's still talking about the same thing, discipline in the church. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And these are rabbi words. Binding and loosing had to do with permitting and restricting behaviors. Again, this is Jesus continuing on. So he's saying the same thing twice. I tell you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three gather in my name, there I am with them. So the issue is not just Christians getting together at Starbucks and, claiming the presence of Jesus, which of course you could, but not on these grounds. The issue is, hey, if a matter is going to be established by two or three witnesses is enough to establish something. Why? Because where two or three are, I am with them. And Paul even talks this way in terms of in the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He's talking about judging somebody in the church, and he's like, even though I'm not present, I've rendered judgment. Hand this person over to Satan, which is its own sort of interesting question. But the idea was, how big a group of people did you need to render a judgment on something? And the idea was two or three eyewitnesses. And so Jesus promises that when two or three eyewitnesses are there rendering a judgment, he is there with them. Now, of course, I hear all of the disclaimers that need to be made in that sentence. Like it doesn't mean that, that two or three hypocrites, Jesus joins them and they do some legalistic, awful covering of abuse thing that Jesus blesses that. No, of course not. Of course not. Of course not. Jesus isn't saying that any behavior that claims the name Christian is Christian. What he's simply promising is that the believers have authority to adjudicate issues within their own fellowships, and that his presence will be with them in that. And that's hence the passage and why it's 2 or 3, because Jesus mentioned 2 or 3 eyewitnesses earlier in the context. So again, of course, Jesus is with us. You can establish that from loads of other passages, but it's just one of those things where, man, in America, and I'm so guilty of this, and that's how I've learned some of this other stuff, is just realizing, oh my goodness, context actually matters in some areas. And so, again, the encouragement is whenever you come across a text like that, read the chapter surrounding it, and often you'll realize, oh, Jesus, the paragraph divisions, the verse numbers, the paragraph headings make it seem like Jesus is talking about a bunch of different topics, when in actuality he's talking about the same thing a couple of different times. So anyway, hope this is helpful. Grateful for all the questions. Got some cool stuff cooking in the future of the podcast. So hope this tied you over until next week, my friends. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance to you, and in these days may he give you peace. Thank you so much. Until next time.